The last thing Margaret Calhoun felt before the wagon door swung open was her own fist connecting with Cole Decker's jaw. It didn't stop him from throwing her out. The red Texas road came up fast and brutal, gravel tearing through her dress, her cheekbone cracking against baked earth with a sound she felt more than heard. She lay still, the summer sun already pressing down on her like a brand iron, blood running hot and thick into the dust beneath her face. But her right hand moved immediately, pressing flat against her ribs, feeling for the crinkle of folded paper hidden beneath her corset. The deed was still there. They hadn't found it, which meant Margaret Calhoun was still alive in every way that mattered. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Maggie. She didn't know how long she'd been lying there before she heard the horse. It wasn't the deliberate approach of a man coming to finish a job. It was the casual, unhurried clop of a working animal that had stopped because something in the road wasn't right. Maggie kept her eyes closed. She'd learned a long time ago that a motionless woman in the dirt got assessed before she got approached, and she needed a half-second to think before she let anyone know she was conscious. "Brutus, hold!" A man's voice, low, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to. She heard the creak of saddle leather, a boot hitting packed earth, then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, no hurry in them at all. "Ma'am?" She didn't move. "I can see your hand twitching, ma'am. You're alive. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know you're going to stay that way." Maggie opened her right eye. The left one wouldn't cooperate. Through the blurred heat shimmer of the Texas midday, she made out a pair of dust-caked boots about 2 feet from her face. Worn at the toe, resoled at least once. Work boots, not the polished riding boots Decker wore. She tried to push herself up. Her left arm buckled immediately, and a white-hot lance of pain shot from her wrist to her shoulder, dropping her back to the dirt with a sound she was humiliated to admit was a whimper. "Don't," the man said, dropping to one knee beside her. "You got something broken in that arm. Don't put weight on it." She felt his hands then, large, calloused, but careful, the way a man is careful when he knows his own strength and respects what it can damage. He turned her gently onto her back, and she blinked up at a face she didn't know. He was somewhere on the far side of 35, with a thick, dark beard shot through with the first threads of silver, and a pair of gray eyes so pale they looked almost colorless in the noon sun. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, a dark leather vest with more pockets than she'd ever seen on a single garment, and a Colt revolver on his right hip that he hadn't touched once. He was looking at her face with the focused, clinical expression of a man cataloging damage, not causing it. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Margaret," she said. Her voice came out as a cracked, sandpapered thing she barely recognized. "Margaret Hale." It wasn't her name. Or rather, it was half of it. Her maiden name, her father's name, the name that belonged to her before Harrison Calhoun's ring went on her finger, and Judge Doyle Whitmore started looking at her property like it already belonged to him. She'd decided on the lie the moment she opened her eye and saw a stranger. The man studied her for a moment with those colorless eyes. "All right, Miss Hale. My name's Eli Granger. I've got a ranch about 4 miles east on Perdition Creek. Can you ride, or do I need to rig a carry?" "I can ride," she said. "Can you stand first?" She made it to sitting on her own, which felt like an enormous personal victory, and then Eli Granger put one arm under hers and lifted her to her feet, with the sort of effortless steadiness that made her understand, in a purely practical way, that this was a man who moved heavy things for a living and thought nothing of it. She swayed. He didn't remove his arm. "Easy," he said. "Take a second." "I don't need a second," Maggie said. even though the road was tilting at a deeply unreasonable angle beneath her feet. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in a tone that made no commitments either way. His horse was a big blue roan gelding, 17 hands if he was an inch, standing ground-tied in the road with the practiced patience of an animal that had been trained by someone who knew what they were doing. A tan and gray dog of indeterminate breed sat beside the horse with its ears up, watching Maggie with intelligent amber eyes. "That's Hatch," Eli said, nodding at the dog. "He won't bother you." "I'm not afraid of dogs," Maggie said. "No," Eli said. "I didn't figure you were." He helped her into the saddle, and she bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from making any sound about her ribs. 2 of them were at minimum cracked. She knew the feeling from a horse fall 3 years back, and this was worse. Eli swung up behind her without asking permission, wrapping one steady arm around her waist to keep her upright. "Just lean back," he said. "I've got you." She didn't lean back. She held herself rigidly upright for approximately a quarter mile before her body made the decision for her, and she had no choice but to settle against his chest, her jaw tight with the humiliation of it. He didn't say anything about it. The 4 miles to his ranch took half an hour at a slow walk, and Maggie spent every minute of it doing what her father had taught her to do in any unfamiliar situation. She listened. Eli Granger spoke to his horse the way some men speak to old friends. Quiet, one-word observations that seemed to be more about keeping the animal's rhythm than communicating anything specific. He checked her pulse once, pressing 2 fingers briefly to the inside of her wrist, and when she tensed, he said only, "Making sure you're not going out on me." And she relaxed fractionally. She was trying to decide how much she could trust him, which was a calculation she'd been bad at her entire adult life. Harrison Calhoun had seemed trustworthy. She'd staked 23 years of her life on that assessment. The ranch, when they reached it, was not what she expected. Not a working cattle operation. The corrals held horses, a dozen of them in various states of wild, and the property had the stripped-down functionality of a man living alone by deliberate choice. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. A stone house instead of a log cabin, low-roofed against the Texas heat, with a covered porch running the full front length of the building. Eli helped her down from the roan and up the porch steps without any performative gentleness, just the same practical steadiness he'd shown in the road, treating her broken state as a problem to solve rather than a condition to pity. She respected that more than she would have respected tenderness. Inside, the main room was dim and significantly cooler than the scalding air outside, the stone walls doing what they were built to do. Eli guided her to a chair at the rough-hewn kitchen table, then went immediately to the pump at the counter, filling a basin with water. "I need to look at that arm," he said, "and whatever else they did to you." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was gathering things from a cabinet with quiet efficiency. Clean cloth, a tin of something, a length of splintboard. "Who's they?" Maggie said. Eli brought the basin to the table and set it down, then pulled a chair around and sat across from her, not beside her, giving her space. "That's what I was going to ask you," he said. "Road agents," she said. "Stopped the wagon I was riding, took my things. I gave them trouble, and they left me in the road." Eli looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He had the most unsettling stillness she'd encountered in a human being. Not the stillness of a slow thinker, but the stillness of a man who had learned to process information without advertising it. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Laredo Springs," she said. "I have business at the county seat." "What kind of business?" "My own kind," Maggie said. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, more like recognition. He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd been considering. And then he said, "Give me your arm." and turned his attention to the practical matter of her injuries, with a completeness that suggested the personal questions were finished, for now. He worked with the focused economy of a man who'd done this before. Not fussing, not narrating, just assessing and addressing. When he pressed along the bones of her forearm and she hissed through her teeth, he said, "Cracked, not broken through. I can splint it." And she said, "Do it." And he did, without ceremony. "Your ribs," he said, when the arm was wrapped and splinted. "Are bruised," she said. "I'll manage." "How many fingers am I holding up?" She looked at his raised hand. "3. I don't have a head injury, Mr. Granger." "You've got a gash above your ear that says different." She reached up with her good hand and found the matted hair along her left temple. She'd known it was there. The blood had dried against her cheek, but she hadn't realized it was still seeping. Eli soaked a cloth in the basin and extended it, handle first, like a tool. She took it and pressed it to her own head. "I'm going to make something for you to eat," he said, standing up. "And you're going to tell me whatever part of that story you're willing to tell, and I'm going to decide what to do from there." "You don't need to do anything," Maggie said. "I need a night's rest. And in the morning, I need to get to Laredo Springs." Eli was already at the stove, and he didn't look back at her when he said, "Laredo Springs is Judge Whitmore's town, Miss Hale. Whatever business you have there, you need to understand what you're walking into." The name hit her like another blow to the ribs. She kept her face still. Her father, before the drink stole most of what he'd been, had been a circuit judge in Missouri, and he'd taught her one thing above all others about the law: never show your cards at the table until you know who's dealing. She didn't know who Eli Granger was yet. She didn't know what he was to Whitmore, or Whitmore to him, or whether the name had fallen from his mouth as warning or as test. "I don't know anyone named Whitmore," she said. Eli turned around then. He looked at her for a long moment with those pale, measuring eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being read, the way a trained man reads a trail. Not the surface of it, but the thing beneath, the compression and the disturbance and the direction of travel. "He's the circuit judge," Eli said simply. "Controls land records for 3 counties. Runs this part of Texas like it's his personal property." He turned back to the stove. "I'm just saying, if your business is legal business, you want to know whose courtroom you're walking into." "I appreciate the warning," Maggie said. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he, for a while. The food he made was simple: cornbread, dried beef reconstituted in a dark pan broth, black coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous administration. He set it in front of her without asking if she was hungry, which she was, desperately, though she ate slowly because her jaw ached from where Decker's backhand had caught her in the wagon. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "How long?" 4 years. "You had the Pinkerton badge on your vest yesterday," she said. It wasn't true. She hadn't seen any badge. But she watched his face when she said it. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I used to work for Pinkerton," he said. "I don't anymore." "Why not?" He picked up his coffee. "Same reason a man stops doing most things," he said. "It stopped being worth the cost." She filed that away and said nothing more about it. Later, when he'd cleaned and stitched the cut above her ear with a steadiness of hand that again suggested prior experience, and when the afternoon heat had broken into the slightly less murderous territory of early evening, Eli showed her to a small back room with a narrow bed and a window facing west. The room had the particular emptiness of a space that had always been a guest room and had never, in recent memory, held a guest. "I'll be on the porch," he said. You need anything in the night, holler. I'm a light sleeper." He was turning to go when Maggie said, "Mr. Granger." He stopped, hand on the doorframe. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "In the road. Men ride past worse than me every day in this territory." Eli was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the floor, not at her. "My mother died in a ditch off the Chisholm Trail when I was 11 years old," he said. "I was in town buying flour. Horse threw her 2 miles back and nobody stopped." He raised his eyes to hers, and there was nothing self-pitying in his expression, just the flat, weathered truth of a man who had made his peace with a particular grief a long time ago and no longer needed sympathy for it. "I have never once ridden past a person in a road since then." He left, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him. Maggie sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dimming light and waited until she heard his boots settle on the porch boards before she reached into the neck of her dress with her good hand, feeling down past the torn corset edge, and withdrew the folded documents. 3 pages of paper, sweat-damp and creased, with Harrison Calhoun's signature at the bottom of each one, and the notary seal of a Missouri clerk pressed into the lower left corner, dated 4 years before Harrison ever set foot in Texas. The original deed to the Calhoun land. Not the deed Whitmore had filed in the county records. The one she'd found in Harrison's strongbox 2 months before he died. The one that proved the land had been purchased with her father's money, under her name, not Harrison's, meaning that upon her husband's death, under Missouri property law, it reverted entirely to her. Meaning Whitmore's claim was fraudulent. His entire empire of stolen Texas land, built on records that would collapse the moment someone compared them to this document. She told Harrison when she found it. Harrison had gone to see Whitmore 3 days later and come home quiet and pale, and had never spoken of it again. 6 weeks after that, Harrison Calhoun was dead of what Whitmore's pet doctor called heart failure, and Cole Decker had shown up at her door with a court order transferring the property to the county pending probate. She had taken the deed and run. She'd made it as far as the Perdition Creek Road before Decker caught up to the wagon. He didn't know she'd had time to hide it. He'd been too busy hitting her to search her carefully, which had been a professional error on his part and the only stroke of luck she'd had in 2 months. Maggie folded the papers and pressed them back against her ribs. Then she lay down on Eli Granger's narrow bed, stared at the ceiling in the last orange light of a Texas summer evening, and began to calculate her next move. She needed to get to a telegraph office before Whitmore's men figured out she was still alive. She needed to reach her father's old law partner in Jefferson City before Whitmore could file the fraudulent transfer and make it stick. And she needed to do all of it without letting Eli Granger know what she was carrying, because she did not yet know what Eli Granger was, and she had already learned, at significant personal cost, the price of trusting a man before she understood what he owed and to whom. Outside, she could hear him on the porch, the occasional creak of a chair, the soft sound of the dog shifting position, and once, very quietly, the scratch of a match and the long exhale of a man sitting in the dark with his thoughts. She pressed one hand flat against the deed beneath her dress. She had survived Cole Decker. She had survived the road. She was inside 4 stone walls with a man who had stitched her head and fed her and asked for nothing. Tomorrow, she would figure out whether Eli Granger was an asset or a complication. Tonight, her body had run out of argument, and she slept. She woke before dawn with her hand already pressed against the deed. It took her 3 full seconds to remember where she was, and in those 3 seconds, her body cataloged everything that hurt, which was most of it. Her splinted arm throbbed with a deep, insistent rhythm. Her ribs protested the simple act of breathing. The stitched cut above her ear had tightened in the night and pulled unpleasantly when she turned her head. She lay still in the gray pre-dawn dark of Eli Granger's spare room and listened to the ranch breathe around her. Horses shifting in the corral, the dog moving on the porch, the absolute silence of open Texas country before the heat woke up and started pressing down on everything. She heard Eli before she saw any light under his door. He was already moving, already working, with the quiet efficiency of a man whose mornings had long since stopped requiring any mental engagement. Water running at the pump, the particular scrape and clank of a cast iron pan. Then boots on the stone floor, deliberate and unhurried. Maggie sat up slowly, gritted her teeth through the rib pain, and began the undignified project of making herself presentable with one functional arm. By the time she got to the main room, Eli had eggs in the pan and coffee on the stove, and he looked up at her with the same measuring assessment he'd applied the day before, checking her the way you'd check a fence line, looking for anything that had shifted in the night. "You slept," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some," she said. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down." "No," he agreed, "but you're going to want to, and it'd be easier on both of us if you were already sitting." She sat. The chair scraped on the stone floor, and the sound was aggressively ordinary, and she found, unexpectedly, that ordinary was exactly what her body needed after 2 days of nothing but crisis. He set coffee in front of her without asking. She wrapped her good hand around the tin cup and held it there, letting the heat work into her palm. "I need to get to Laredo Springs today," she said. Eli turned the eggs. "You need to not ride 12 miles on cracked ribs and a splinted arm today." "I didn't ask for a medical opinion." "You're getting one anyway." He slid the eggs onto a plate, set it in front of her, and then pulled out the chair across the table and sat down with his own coffee and looked at her steadily. "What's in Laredo Springs that's worth killing yourself to get to today specifically?" "I told you. Business." "You told me a word," Eli said. "That's not the same thing." She ate 2 bites of egg and considered him. He was watching her the way she'd watched witnesses in her father's courtroom as a girl. Not impatiently, not suspiciously, just with a particular quality of attention that communicates a willingness to wait as long as necessary for the real answer. "There's a telegraph office," she said finally. "I need to send a message to Jefferson City, Missouri." Something shifted in Eli's expression. Not much. "Who do you know in Jefferson City?" "A lawyer." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "Whitmore has a man at the telegraph office in Laredo Springs. Has for 2 years. Name of Percy Good. Reads every wire that comes through before it goes out." Maggie set her fork down. "There's a second office," Eli continued, in the same even tone. "Railroad depot at Copper Bend, 15 miles north. Whitmore doesn't have reach there yet. The Texas Pacific keeps their own man." He met her eyes. "I'm just telling you, in case it affects your plans." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you're going to try to get to Laredo Springs with or without my help," Eli said. "And I'd rather you get to the right telegraph office. You don't know anything about what I'm trying to do." "No," he said simply, "but I know what Whitmore does to people who try to do things he doesn't want done. I've watched him do it for 4 years from close enough to see the details." He stood up, taking his cup to the counter. "You don't have to tell me anything, Miss Hale. But if you're going up against Doyle Whitmore, you should know that road you were lying in yesterday is the tamest thing his people do." He said it without drama, without the self-importance of a man delivering a warning he wants credit for. He said it the way you'd tell someone a bridge was out. As simple, useful information. Take it or leave it. Maggie pressed her good hand flat on the table. "How do you know Whitmore?" Eli's back was to her. She watched his shoulders settle, not tense, just careful. "I investigated him," he said, "when I was with Pinkerton. 3 years ago, the Texas Pacific hired the agency to look into land acquisition irregularities along their planned southern route. Somebody was filing fraudulent transfers, running legitimate landowners off their property, then selling the cleared land to the railroad at inflated prices." He turned around. His face was completely composed, which Maggie had already learned meant the opposite of what composure usually meant in a man. It meant something underneath was under significant pressure. "I built a case," he said. 18 months of field work. Documented 47 fraudulent transfers, 3 suspicious deaths, 2 judges on Whitmore's payroll, including Whitmore himself. He paused. "I filed the report with my supervisor in Chicago. 2 weeks later, I was told the investigation was closed. The Texas Pacific had reached an arrangement with the county land office. My report was sealed." "The railroad was in on it," Maggie said. "The railroad was the customer," Eli said. "Whitmore was delivering them land at below-market prices with clean paperwork. Why would they stop that?" He looked at her steadily. "I resigned the following Monday. Came out here and bought this piece of land for cash and put horses on it because horses don't require title searches." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the horses moving in the corral outside, and the first gathering heat of the morning beginning to press against the stone walls. "Your husband was Harrison Calhoun," Eli said. It was not a question. Maggie went very still. "Calhoun's land runs along Perdition Creek for 6 miles, Eli said. His voice was careful and steady and gave nothing away. "I've been his neighbor for 4 years. He was a decent man who kept to himself and didn't make enemies. And then 8 weeks ago, he was dead, and Whitmore had a transfer order filed inside of a week." He looked at her directly. "I watched you ride out with your father's name and your maiden bearing and a broken arm. And I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Calhoun, because I think you're going to need honesty more than comfort right now. Whatever you have on Whitmore, he already knows you survived. Cole Decker does not make mistakes twice. He will be looking for you." The sound of her real name in his mouth after a night of the false one was a peculiar kind of relief. The way setting down a heavy thing is a relief even when you needed to be carrying it. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since last night," he said. "The Calhoun brand is on the saddle blanket in my tack room. Your husband borrowed it 2 years ago, and I never asked for it back." He paused. "I didn't say anything, because you weren't ready to." She looked at him. This man who had pulled her out of a road and fed her and stitched her head and slept on a porch chair so she could have the only bed, and who had sat on information that could have complicated his life significantly and had simply waited for her to get there on her own. "The deed," she said. "The original deed to the Calhoun land. It was filed in Missouri before Harrison ever came to Texas. It names me as the primary owner under my maiden name, Margaret Hale Calhoun. Under Missouri property law, the land is mine outright. It never belonged to the Texas County records. Whitmore's transfer order is built on a fraudulent claim that Harrison owned the property solely." She reached into the neck of her dress and pulled the papers out and laid them on the table between them. Eli looked at them. He didn't touch them. He read the top page from where he sat, and she watched his expression as he read, looking for the thing that would tell her whether she'd been right to trust him. What she saw was recognition. The particular, tired recognition of a man who has seen a mechanism he already knows operate one more time. "He'll say it's forged," Eli said quietly. "He'll try," Maggie said. "But the notary seal is registered in Cole County, Missouri. The notary's name is Bernard Atchison. He's been practicing in Jefferson City for 30 years, and he's never lost a case in court." My father's law partner, Thomas Hale, my uncle by marriage, has a copy of every document Bernard Atchison ever notarized. If I can get a wire to Thomas before Whitmore knows I'm alive, Thomas can get a federal attorney into the county records in Laredo Springs before Whitmore has time to bury the transfer. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Hatch barked twice at something in the scrub beyond the corral. A short, alert sound, not alarmed, and then went silent. "There's something else," Eli said. His tone had changed. Marginally, but Maggie had spent a month paying extremely close attention to the way men's voices changed when they were delivering the part of the news they'd been holding back. And she recognized it immediately. "Cole Decker rode through here yesterday afternoon," Eli said, "while you were sleeping. He didn't come to the door. I saw him from the east pasture. He rode the Perdition Creek road slow, looking at the ground. He's tracking." The word landed in the room with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. "He'll find where you went into the road and where my horse picked up your trail," Eli said. "A man like Decker, in this heat, with dry ground, that's maybe a day before he knows which direction you went." "Then I need to leave now," Maggie said, pushing back her chair. "You need to think," Eli said, and his voice was sharp enough that she stopped. He was looking at her with those pale, direct eyes. "Running without a plan is how you end up back on the road, Mrs. Calhoun. Decker is a professional. You run, he tracks. You need to be somewhere specific before he finds where you are, not just somewhere else." She looked at him. "Copper Bend," she said. "The railroad telegraph." "Yes." "How long to get there?" "On horseback, healthy? 4 hours. In your condition, with pace that won't shake those ribs loose? 6. We'd need to leave within the hour to get there before the office closes." She noticed the word, "we." "Mr. Granger," she said carefully. "Eli," he said. "Eli, you understand what you're getting involved in." He picked up the deed from the table with 2 careful fingers and extended it back to her. "I built an 18-month case on Doyle Whitmore and watched it get buried by the people I was working for," he said. "I've spent 4 years on this piece of land watching him take everything around me, one property at a time, and telling myself it wasn't my fight anymore." He held her gaze. "You're sitting in my kitchen with the only piece of paper I've seen in 4 years that can actually put him away. Mrs. Calhoun, this has been my fight the whole time. I was just waiting for a reason to pick it back up." She took the deed from his hand. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The morning heat was starting in earnest now, pressing through the stone walls, and out in the corral the horses were moving restlessly. "I need my arm to be functional enough to shoot if necessary," Maggie said. "The splint allows your trigger finger," Eli said. "I checked when I wrapped it." "Of course you did," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the place where one might live in a man who had more practice. He stood up and went to the wall, where a Winchester carbine hung on 2 iron pegs, lifted it down, checked the load with the automatic ease of long habit. "I'll saddle the horses," he said. "You get whatever you need together. We have 1 stop to make before we head north." "Where?" He was already at the door. "My neighbor to the west, Clara Hofstede. She's got a trunk of her daughter's clothes that might be closer to your size than what you came in with. You ride into Copper Bend looking like you crawled out of a fight. Someone's going to remember you." He went out before she could respond to that, letting the screen door bang behind him. She heard him talking to the roan in the low, easy voice he used with animals, heard the specific sound of a man who knew his way around a saddle and was moving through the work quickly, without rushing it. Maggie looked down at the deed in her hand. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it back against her ribs, and stood up. She was pulling Harrison Calhoun's ranch back from a man who had stolen it and murdered for it, with a broken arm and cracked ribs and one ally who had been a stranger 24 hours ago. Her father would have called the odds unfavorable. Her father had also taught her that favorable odds were for people who had better options. She had exactly one option, and it was a former Pinkerton detective who lived alone with a dog and had apparently been waiting 4 years for a fight worth having. She supposed there were worse allies. She went to get ready. She was on the porch with the Colt Eli had given her, tucked into the waistband of her skirt. More useful there than in her splinted hand, when she heard hoofbeats. She went still. They were coming from the south, from the direction of the Perdition Creek Road, and there were 2 sets of them, moving fast. Eli appeared from the corral at a controlled walk that she already understood meant he was moving quickly without showing it. He had the Winchester in his right hand, and his eyes on the southern tree line. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Is it Decker?" "Can't tell yet. Get inside, Mrs. Calhoun." "If it's Decker, 2 of us out here is better than—" "Margaret." He said it low and flat, and looked at her directly for one moment. "Please." She went inside, but she stood at the window with the Colt cocked and watched. The 2 riders that came out of the tree line were not Cole Decker. One was a boy of about 16 on a spotted pony, and the other was a stout woman in her 50s on a sturdy bay mare. And the woman pulled up in front of the porch with the proprietary ease of someone who had been riding to this property for years. "Eli Granger," the woman said in a voice like a school teacher who expected immediate compliance. "I have news, and it is not the good kind. So put that rifle down and listen." Eli lowered the Winchester. Clara Hofstede dismounted with the brisk competence of a woman who had never once waited for help doing anything. She walked up the porch steps and stopped when she saw Maggie through the screen door, and her expression shifted into something Maggie couldn't immediately read. Not suspicion, but a quick, assessing intelligence that felt familiar. "So you found her," Clara said to Eli. "Good. Come inside, both of you." She pushed past Eli toward the door, pulling it open and looking directly at Maggie. "My name is Clara Hofstede. My land borders this one to the west, and I've known this man since before he had sense." She looked Maggie over with frank, unhurried attention, the way a practical woman examines a situation rather than a person. "Cole Decker was in town this morning. He's been telling people you're a criminal, that you stole property documents from your dead husband's estate and fled before you could be arrested." Maggie's hand tightened on the Colt. "He's showing a description," Clara continued, folding her hands in front of her with the composure of a woman delivering facts, not drama. "Red-brown hair, medium height, left arm injured. He's offering $50 to anyone who brings information about your location." She looked at Eli. "And he came to my property this morning, asking if I'd seen a strange woman on the road." "What did you tell him?" Eli said. Clara's expression did not change. "I told him I hadn't seen anything unusual," she said. Which was technically true at the time, since I hadn't come here yet. She pulled out a chair at Eli's table and sat down as if she owned it, which, from her manner, she very nearly felt she did. "Now, someone tell me what's actually in those documents, because I have 7 years of my own tax records that Whitmore's office has been disputing, and if there's a way to bury that man legally, I want to know if I'm in a position to help." Maggie looked at her. Then she looked at Eli. Eli set the Winchester against the wall and said, "Clara, we're riding to Copper Bend within the hour. How fast can your boy ride back to your property and get back here with whatever you think we'll need?" Clara Hofstede smiled for the first time. It was a small, dangerous, entirely satisfied expression. "Faster than Decker," she said. Clara's boy, whose name was Samuel, and who turned out to be faster on a horse than anyone had a right to expect, was back within 40 minutes carrying a canvas saddlebag that Clara packed with the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had learned exactly what mattered in a crisis and had no patience for anything that didn't. A dress the color of old wheat, sturdy enough to pass for a traveling woman's practical choice. A small leather coin purse with $30 in it. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be 7 years of Clara Hofstede's property tax receipts, hand-copied in a meticulous schoolteacher's hand, with 3 separate notations where the county assessor's office had applied charges against parcels Clara could document she had already paid. "My husband kept every receipt," Clara said, handing the paper to Maggie. "Whitmore's office told me the records were lost in a filing error. I told them I had copies. They stopped disputing and started delaying instead." She looked at Maggie steadily. "If your deed proves what you say it proves, my records prove a pattern. 1 irregular transfer is a mistake. 47 is a criminal enterprise." Eli was at the door with both horses ready, the Winchester in the saddle scabbard and a second revolver tucked in his belt. He looked at Clara. "You go back to your property, and you don't open the door to Decker or anyone riding with him." "I've been not opening doors to people I don't want in my house since 1861, Clara said dryly. "I don't require instruction." She turned to Maggie and took her good hand briefly, with the firm, no-nonsense grip of a woman who expressed what she felt through usefulness rather than sentiment. "You get that wire out, and you come back through here on your way to Laredo Springs. I've got 3 neighbors who've lost land to Whitmore's office in the last 2 years, and I guarantee you they'll want to be in that courtroom." Maggie pressed her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Hofstede." "Clara," she said, "we're past formalities." She went out the door and down the porch steps with Samuel behind her, and she was mounted and moving before the screen door had finished swinging shut. Eli looked at Maggie. "Ready?" "10 minutes ago," she said. They rode north. The Texas heat, by mid-morning, was a physical thing. Not just temperature, but presence, pressing down from above and radiating up from the baked earth simultaneously, until the air between felt like something you pushed through rather than moved in. Maggie had changed into Clara's dress in the spare room, and it fit well enough where it mattered. She'd tucked the colt into the deep pocket she'd found sewn into the skirt, a practical woman's garment, made by someone who understood that pockets were not decoration. And she rode with her splinted arm resting across the saddle horn, keeping the jolting to a minimum. Eli set a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to shake her apart. And she didn't thank him for it, because she understood by now that he'd calculated it the same way he calculated everything, without sentiment, as a practical requirement. And thanking him for being practical would have embarrassed them both. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, but it was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people managing a significant amount of internal activity and keeping it off their faces. Finally, Maggie said, "Tell me about Decker." Eli was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. Cole Decker spent 8 years as a range detective for a cattle association in Colorado. What that means in practice is he tracked rustlers, and sometimes the tracking ended with a rope, and sometimes it ended earlier than that. And the association didn't ask questions about which. He paused. "He came to Texas 4 years ago, around the same time I was closing my Pinkerton investigation. Whitmore put him on as county investigator, which is a title with no legal definition and no oversight. He does what Whitmore needs done, and Whitmore provides the paperwork to make it look official." "He killed Harrison," Maggie said. She said it flat, not as a question. "I think so," Eli said. "I can't prove it." "I can." She felt him look at her and kept her eyes on the road. "Harrison told me 2 days before he died that Decker had come to the ranch while I was in town. He said Decker offered to buy the land directly, said he was acting as an agent for an unnamed party. Harrison told him no. Harrison told me it felt wrong, the way Decker looked at him when he said no. Like the answer was something Decker was going to work around rather than accept. She paused. I found Harrison in the barn 4 days later. The doctor Whitmore sent said heart failure. Harrison Calhoun was 51 years old, and he'd ridden this land every day of those 4 years. His heart was fine. Eli didn't say anything immediately. She could feel the quality of his silence, the particular weight of a man absorbing something he'd suspected and was now having confirmed. There's a woman in Copper Bend, he said finally. Name of Ruth Alderman. She runs the boarding house across from the depot. Her husband died 2 years ago. Land on the eastern ridge, backed up against the Texas Pacific right-of-way. Same story. Whitmore's transfer order came in before the body was cold. He looked at her. She's been trying to find a lawyer who'd take the case for 2 years. Nobody in 3 counties will touch it. Because Whitmore controls the courts, Maggie said. Every circuit judge from here to San Antonio either owes him money or is afraid of Decker, Eli said. The only jurisdiction that can touch him is federal. He met her eyes briefly. Which is exactly why you need your uncle in Jefferson City. Thomas isn't just a lawyer, Maggie said. He spent 6 years as a federal prosecutor before he went into private practice. He knows every federal judge in Missouri and half of them in Texas. If I can get him the deed and Clara's tax records and a sworn account of what happened on that road, he can get a federal marshal's office involved before Whitmore knows what's coming. She paused. The bank drafts are the key. If Whitmore paid Decker through traceable accounts, that's interstate fraud. That pulls in federal jurisdiction automatically. Eli was quiet, and she could see him turning it over, checking it the way you'd check a structure for load-bearing capacity, not doubting it, just making sure it would hold what she was planning to put on it. It'll hold, she said, reading him accurately enough that he glanced at her sideways with something that might, in a more expressive man, have been surprise. I was going to say the same thing, he said. I know, she said. I could see you getting there. The second hour of the ride passed with more talking than the first, and Maggie found that Eli Granger's conversation, once he committed to it, had the same quality as his work, efficient, specific, without waste. He told her things she needed to know about Copper Bend without being asked. The telegraph operator was a man named Hector Fines, honest, railroad loyal, who would send a wire exactly as written without reading it to anyone. The depot master kept records of every wire sent and received, and those records were legally property of the Texas Pacific, not the county. If Decker came to Copper Bend looking for Maggie's communications, he'd need a federal order to access the depot's files, and Whitmore's county authority ended at the Perdition Creek Road. She told him about Thomas Hale in Jefferson City, about the office above the cobbler's shop on Capitol Avenue, about Thomas's habit of eating lunch at his desk every day at noon and being unreachable for exactly 45 minutes, about the particular way he'd signed his name since a hand injury in the war had taken the full mobility of his right ring finger, and how Eli should recognize his response wire if it came back before she was there to read it herself. She told him this last part because it was possible she wouldn't be there to read it herself, and they both understood that without saying it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which she appreciated more than she could reasonably articulate. They were 4 miles from Copper Bend, on a stretch of road that ran between 2 low limestone ridges, when Hatch, who had been running easy and quiet alongside the roan, stopped dead and lifted his nose to the wind. Eli pulled up immediately. The roan stopped. Maggie's horse, a steadier animal than she'd expected from a man's personal string, took the cue and stood. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then from the top of the eastern ridge, loose rock skittered down the face of the limestone, the specific sound of a horse's hoof dislodging something in the heat-cracked stone. Eli didn't look up at the ridge. He looked at the road ahead. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "Don't look up. Keep moving at the same pace." "How many?" she said, equally quiet. "Can't tell. 1 horse minimum." He urged the roan forward at the same steady walk. "Could be a rancher. Could be a line rider." "Could be Decker," Maggie said. "Could be," he agreed. "Keep your hand near that pocket." She kept her hand near the pocket. They rode another 100 yards. The sound from the ridge didn't repeat, but Hatch kept glancing to the east with his ears sharp and forward. And a dog with Hatch's training didn't do that for cattle. "There's a cutoff a quarter-mile ahead," Eli said, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. Because if someone was watching from the ridge, they were also possibly within earshot. "Goes through the cedar breaks, longer by about 40 minutes, but it stays under cover." He looked at her with an expression of complete neutrality. "You want to see that old cedar grove I mentioned? The one your husband used to ride through?" Harrison had never mentioned a cedar grove to her in her life, but Maggie understood what was being offered. "I'd like that," she said, matching his tone exactly. At the cutoff, Eli turned them off the main road with the casual ease of a man who had always been going that direction. And once they were 15 feet into the cedar cover, and the road was screened behind them, he pushed the pace to a trot and held it there, threading through the trees with the practiced knowledge of a man who had ridden this land for 4 years and knew every viable path through it. "Was that him?" Maggie said. "Couldn't confirm," Eli said. "But Decker knows this road. He'd used the ridge for exactly that kind of observation." He checked over his shoulder once, then faced forward. "We'll come out on the north side of Copper Bend. Approach from the opposite direction than he'd expect." "And if he's already there?" "Then we don't go to the telegraph office," Eli said. "We go to Ruth Alderman's boarding house first. She'll know if strangers have been through town this morning." They came out of the cedar break onto a flat stretch of scrubland north of town, and Copper Bend appeared before them as a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings arranged around a single main street, with the railroad depot sitting at the far end like the period at the end of a sentence. The Texas Pacific tracks ran east to west through the southern edge of town, and even from this distance, Maggie could see the telegraph wires running parallel to the rails, thin, dark lines against the white sky. So close. Eli slowed to a walk as they entered the northern end of town. He scanned the street with the systematic, unhurried attention of a man checking a room for exits. Not conspicuous, just thorough. "There," he said quietly, nodding toward a 2-story building on the west side of the street, with a painted sign that said, "Alderman Rooms, board by day or week." Ruth Alderman turned out to be a woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair pinned practically, and eyes that had the focused sharpness of someone who'd been watching the world carefully for a very long time, and had found it generally worth watching. She opened the door to Eli's knock, looked at Maggie's splinted arm and the careful way she was holding herself, and said, "Get inside," before either of them spoke. In her parlor, with the front shutters angled to allow visibility of the street while limiting visibility from it, a habit, Maggie noted, of someone who had been watching for people she didn't want to see, Ruth poured water and looked at Eli. "Cole Decker came through here an hour ago," she said. "Him and a man I didn't know. Broad, heavy, red beard. They went to the depot." Maggie felt the cold move through her, despite the heat. "Did they go to the telegraph office?" Eli asked. "They went inside the depot building," Ruth said. "I don't know what they said to Hector." They were in there about 10 minutes, and when they came out, Decker looked satisfied, which in my experience is the worst thing Decker can look. She turned her gaze to Maggie with the frank, assessing directness that seemed to be the characteristic of women who'd survived significant losses and come out the other side still standing. "You're the Calhoun woman." "Yes," Maggie said. "Decker's saying you stole documents. I retrieved documents that legally belong to me from a house that legally belongs to me, Maggie said. The distinction matters. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair across from them and folded her hands in her lap. My husband's name was George Alderman, she said. He owned 160 acres on the Eastern Ridge. The transfer order Whitmore filed claimed George had voluntarily sold the land to the county 3 weeks before he died. George Alderman did not sell that land. George Alderman would not have sold that land for any price on earth because his father built the first fence post on it in 1859. She paused. I have the original bill of sale from 1859. I have George's will, leaving the land to me. I have a letter in George's handwriting from 2 weeks before he died, saying he'd told Whitmore's office to go to the devil. Her voice was entirely steady. Tell me what you need. Eli leaned forward. We need to get to Hector Fines without Decker knowing, and we need to know what Decker said to him in that depot. Ruth stood up. Hector Fines eats his dinner at my table every night. Has done for 3 years since his wife passed. I can have him here in 20 minutes on a pretext he'll believe. She was already moving toward the back of the house. There's a back room upstairs. Nobody on the street can see the window. You wait there. She said it with the efficient command of a woman who had thought about contingencies long before this particular contingency had arrived. And Maggie followed her upstairs with the specific gratitude of someone who has been alone in a fight long enough to understand exactly how much an ally is worth. The back room was small and airless in the midday heat. Eli stood near the wall, the Winchester in his hand, watching the rear of the building with the alert stillness he'd shown in the cedar breaks. Not tense, just present, the way a man is present when he's accepted that something is coming and decided to meet it on his own terms. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed and took the deed from inside her dress and smoothed it carefully on her knee, checking again that the notary seal was intact, that Harrison's signature was fully legible, that the date was clear. She had checked it a dozen times since Decker threw her from the wagon. She checked it again now. It's intact, Eli said without looking at her. I know, she said. Then stop checking it. She folded the deed and held it in her hands instead. What did your case file look like? She asked. The Pinkerton investigation. When you built it. He glanced at her. 18 months of field notes, bank records I pulled through the agency's Chicago contacts, copies of the fraudulent transfers cross-referenced against county death records. He paused. Witness statements from 6 families who'd been displaced. One of them was the Harker family, east of Laredo Springs. Father, mother, 4 kids. They'd built on their land for 11 years. Where are they now? Don't know, Eli said. They were gone by the time my report was sealed. I tried to find them to tell them what happened, and I couldn't. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall. That bothered me more than the report getting buried. That I couldn't find them to tell them someone had seen what happened. Maggie looked at him. This man who had walked away from the only institutional framework that had given his work any power, who had spent 4 years on a piece of Texas land, training horses, and living with the specific, grinding frustration of a person who knows exactly what is wrong and has no lever left to apply to it. She thought about what it cost him to pick this fight back up. She thought about the particular kind of courage required to try the same thing a second time after watching it fail the first. When this is over, she said, and we get into those county records, your field notes, do you still have them? He looked at her directly. Every page. Then the Harker family and every other family Whitmore displaced is going to have their day in a federal court, she said. That's what I'm promising you. Not just my land, all of it. The stillness in his face shifted in a way that was different from anything she'd seen in it before. Not quite the non-smile she'd observed that morning, but something deeper and older, something that looked like a man putting a weight down that he hadn't realized he'd still been carrying. Before he could answer, they heard the back door of the boarding house open below them, and Ruth Alderman's voice, entirely calm, saying, "Hector, come in. I need to show you something." Maggie stood up, pressed the deed flat against her palm, and looked at Eli. "Time to go to work," she said. He checked the Winchester one last time and nodded. "Let's finish it." Hector Fines was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the careful, precise movements of someone who had spent 20 years handling fragile things. He came into Ruth's back parlor with his hat in his hands and stopped when he saw Eli, and then Maggie, and his expression moved through several things quickly before settling on something that looked, to Maggie's eye, like guilty relief. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said. He said it like a man who had been expecting to have to say it and hadn't enjoyed the anticipation. "Hector." Ruth's voice was firm and quiet. "Sit down and tell them what Decker said to you this morning." Hector sat. He set his hat on his knee and looked at it for a moment, turning the brim in his hands. "He told me there was a fugitive woman traveling with a man. Said she'd stolen legal documents from a deceased estate and was planning to transmit fraudulent communications over the telegraph line." He paused. "He showed me a county order signed by Judge Whitmore, directing me to detain any wire originating from or directed to a Margaret Calhoun or any alias thereof, and to notify his office immediately." "And you accepted that order?" Eli said. His voice was level, no accusation in it, just the question. Hector looked up at him. "It had Whitmore's seal on it." "Whitmore's county seal has no legal authority over railroad communications," Maggie said. She kept her voice equally level because she needed this man's cooperation, and she would not get it by making him feel like a fool. "The Texas Pacific Telegraph operates under a federal communications charter. A county judge cannot issue a restraining order against it without a federal co-signature. Did that order have one?" Hector blinked. He thought about it. "No," he said slowly. "It didn't." "Then it's not a lawful order," Maggie said. "It's a piece of paper with a wax seal on it. And the difference between those two things is what we are here to talk about." She leaned forward slightly. "Hector, how long have you worked for the Texas Pacific?" 19 years, he said. "In those 19 years, has Judge Whitmore ever sent you a county order regarding telegraph communications?" A pause. "No." "Has anyone ever sent you such an order?" "No." "Then what made today different?" Hector's hands went still on his hat brim. He was a quiet man, clearly, a man who processed things inwardly rather than broadcasting them, and she watched him process this one. "Decker," he said finally. Decker was standing right there. "Yes," Maggie said. "He was." She set the deed on the table in front of Hector and smoothed it flat. "I need you to read the notary information at the bottom of that page and tell me if you recognize the form." Hector leaned forward, reading. His eyes tracked slowly down the page. When he reached the notary seal, he stopped. He looked up at Maggie. "Bernard Atchison," he said. "Cole County, Missouri." "Do you know that name?" "I've transmitted wires to that office," Hector said slowly. "Texas Pacific Legal Department uses Atchison's firm for interstate property documentation." He looked at the deed again. "This is a primary title document." "It is the primary title document," Maggie said. "It predates every record Whitmore has filed in Laredo Springs by 4 years. And what I need from you, Hector, is to transmit a wire to Jefferson City, Missouri, to Thomas Hale at Hale and Duchamp Legal on Capitol Avenue. And I need that wire to go out exactly as I write it, under the Texas Pacific's federal charter, with a full transmission record kept in your depot files. Hector looked at the deed for a long moment. He looked at Ruth, who met his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who has already decided where she stands and is waiting to see where he lands. He looked at Eli, who was watching him with those pale, quiet eyes and not saying anything, which was somehow more persuasive than anything he might have said. "Decker's still in town," Hector said. "I know," Eli said. "If he finds out I sent this wire—" "Hector!" Ruth's voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. "George Alderman was your friend for 20 years. You came to his funeral. You sat in my parlor and told me he was the finest man you'd known in this county." She paused, letting that settle. "Decker filed that transfer order 3 days after George was in the ground. You know that. You've always known that." She folded her hands in her lap. This is the moment where knowing it means something, or it doesn't. The room was very quiet. Hector Fines picked up the deed carefully with both hands, the way he handled everything fragile, and stood up. "Write your wire, Mrs. Calhoun," he said. "I'll transmit it under the federal charter, and I'll log it in the depot record with the full documentation attached." He looked at her directly. "And I'll keep a copy in my personal files, in case anything happens to the depot records." Maggie exhaled. "Thank you, Hector." "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "Thank me when the marshal's office actually shows up." He went out the way he came in, through Ruth's back door, moving with more purpose than he'd arrived with. Ruth watched him go and then looked at Eli. "How long before we know if Decker's seen him go back to the depot?" "If Decker's watching the depot, he already knows," Eli said. "The question is whether he'll wait to see what comes of it or move now." He looked at Maggie. "Write the wire. Make it complete. Everything. The deed, Clara's records, the account of what happened on the road, Decker's visit to Harrison before he died. All of it. Thomas Hale needs the full picture in one transmission." Maggie was already writing, using the paper and pencil Ruth had put on the table without being asked. She wrote with the focused speed of a woman who had grown up watching a lawyer work, who had sat in her father's office as a child and learned that the specific, precise language of legal communication was not a formality, but a weapon, and that its power was in its exactness. She wrote for 10 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she read it back once, changed 2 words, and handed it to Ruth. Ruth read it. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "This is enough," she said. "It should be," Maggie said. "Thomas will know what to do with it." Ruth folded the paper and went to take it to Hector. In the quiet that followed, Maggie became aware of how much her arm hurt and how little she had eaten since that morning, and how the heat in the room had been building steadily toward something that pressed against her temples with the specific unpleasantness of an oncoming headache. She pressed her good hand to her eyes for a moment. "Sit down," Eli said from behind her. "I'm fine." "Margaret?" Just her name, in the quiet, direct way he'd used it that morning on the porch. She sat down. He brought her water from the pitcher on the sideboard and set it in front of her without comment, and she drank half of it before she remembered she'd been planning to manage on her own. "What happens now?" she said. "We wait for a return wire from Jefferson City," Eli said, leaning against the wall near the window where he could watch the street. "Thomas Hale gets your transmission. He moves immediately, or he doesn't. If he moves, a federal marshal's office gets involved, and Whitmore's authority in this county effectively ends the moment that happens. If he doesn't, he will," Maggie said. "Thomas has been waiting for something he could take to federal court on Whitmore for 2 years. 3 families in his legal circle lost land in this county between 1875 and 1877. He has personal reasons." "How long for a return wire?" "If Thomas is in his office and he reads it immediately, 2 hours. If he's in court, Could be until evening. She looked at the light coming through the shuttered window. It was early afternoon. We have time. Eli nodded. He was watching the street with the patient, slightly unfocused gaze of someone who was watching for pattern rather than detail, not looking for a specific thing, but for the thing that broke the pattern of ordinary movement. She had seen her father's bailiff watch a courtroom the same way. "You were good at it," she said. "The Pinkerton work." He glanced at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're still doing it," she said. "The way you watch a street. The way you asked Hector questions. You weren't interviewing him. You were guiding him to a conclusion he was already capable of reaching. That's an investigator's skill, not a rancher's." Eli was quiet for a moment. "I was good at the work," he said. "I was bad at what came after the work. The politics. The accommodation," he said, and the word came out with the particular flatness of something that has been compressed over time into a very small, very dense shape. The understanding that your findings are a starting point for negotiation rather than a foundation for action. He paused. "I don't negotiate well." "I noticed," Maggie said. Something moved in his face. "That an observation or a complaint?" "An asset," she said, "in the current circumstances." Before he could respond to that, Hatch, who had been lying near the back door with his chin on his paws, lifted his head sharply. Eli straightened from the wall in one smooth motion, his hand going to the revolver at his belt. He moved to the edge of the window and looked through the angled shutter slats, and Maggie stood without being told to, her hand finding the pocket with the Colt. "West end of the street," Eli said quietly. "Two men. One of them's the rider from the ridge." She came to the other edge of the window, keeping back from the light. The man Eli meant was immediately identifiable, broad through the chest with a red beard, moving with the particular rolling, heavy-footed walk of a man accustomed to covering ground. He was scanning the storefronts as he walked, not casually, but methodically, the way you scan when you're looking for something specific. "That's not Decker," she said. "No, Decker's the one talking to him." Eli's voice dropped further. On the far side of the broad man, closer to the center of the street, a leaner figure had appeared, and the lean figure was Decker, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace she remembered from the wagon road, the walk of a man who was in no hurry because he had already decided the outcome. "They're going to the depot." "Hector's in the depot," Maggie said. "Yes." Eli turned from the window. His expression was controlled and completely focused. "I need you to stay in this room." "Eli, not for your protection," he said directly. "Because you are the only person in this building who can walk into a federal courtroom and swear to what's in that deed. And if Decker sees you before that wire is confirmed sent, none of the rest of it matters. Ruth and I can manage the depot." He held her gaze. "Can you trust me to handle this part?" She looked at him. This man who had resigned his career rather than accommodate a system that protected the wrong people, who had spent 4 years waiting for something worth fighting for, and had picked it up the moment it landed in his road, who had checked the angle of her splint so her trigger finger was free and hadn't mentioned it until it was relevant. "Yes," she said. He was at the back door when she said, "Eli." He stopped. "If Decker puts his hands on Hector Fines," she said, "you have my full legal authorization as the rightful property owner of record to act in defense of a witness in a federal matter." His expression was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I'll keep that in mind," and went out. Maggie went back to the window. She watched Eli come around the far corner of the building and move along the boardwalk toward the depot with a walk she hadn't seen from him before. Not the deliberate ranch work stride she'd been watching all day, but something quieter and more deliberate. The walk of a man who has stopped thinking about what he's doing because his body knows it without instruction. The Winchester was in his right hand, low, and his left hand was empty and visible. Decker reached the depot steps the same moment Eli reached the street in front of them. She couldn't hear what was said. She read it instead. The posture, the spacing, the specific way each man's weight distributed when the other spoke. Decker turned when Eli spoke, and even at this distance, she could see the assessment happen in real time. Decker reading Eli the way Eli read everything, fast and thorough, and without showing the work. The red-bearded man moved 2 steps to Decker's right. Eli did not look at the red-bearded man. He kept his eyes on Decker, which was either tactically questionable or a deliberate choice to communicate that the larger man was not a meaningful concern. Given what she knew of Eli Granger, she suspected the latter. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. She counted. At the end of it, Decker smiled, the specific cold smile she had last seen from the wagon window as his men worked, and said something, and Eli said something back, and whatever Eli said made the smile stop. Decker looked at the depot door. He looked at Eli. He looked at the street around them, and Maggie understood that he was calculating the same thing she'd calculated on the road. What the public nature of this confrontation cost him versus what it gained. Decker's particular power was procedural. He operated through county orders and official channels and the authority of Whitmore's signature. And those things lost their force in direct proportion to how many witnesses were watching them be challenged. 3 people had come out of the general store across the street. Ruth Alderman was standing on her front porch, entirely visible, with her arms folded. Decker took a step back. He said one more thing to Eli. Then he turned and walked away, the red-bearded man falling into step beside him, and they went back the way they'd come, without looking back. Maggie let out the breath she'd been holding for 90 seconds. Ruth came inside. Eli was 3 minutes behind her. When he came through the back door, Maggie looked at his face before anything else, and what she saw there was not relief, but a specific, taut alertness. The look of a man who had moved something temporarily rather than removed it. "Hector got the wire out," Eli said, setting the Winchester against the wall. "It transmitted 8 minutes ago. Full documentation, federal charter, logged and copied." "What did Decker say to you?" Maggie asked. Eli looked at her steadily. "He said you'd never make it to Laredo Springs to file anything, because the road between here and there was a long one." He paused. "He said accidents happened to people who meddled in county legal matters. He said he'd be sorry to have to explain to the Federal Telegraph authorities how their operator in Copper Bend had been transmitting fraudulent communications from a known fugitive." His jaw was tight, but his voice stayed level. "I told him the Texas Pacific's legal charter was older than his county seal, that their operator had acted within proper federal authority, and that if anything happened to anyone in this town between now and a federal marshal's arrival, I would personally deliver his name and a sworn account of this conversation to the United States Attorney's Office in Austin." "And he walked away," Ruth said, from her chair by the window. She sounded unsurprised. "Men like Decker don't fight in the open," Eli said. "They don't have to. They wait." He looked at Maggie. "He'll move at night, or on the road, where there aren't witnesses. He's not done." "Neither are we," Maggie said. Ruth stood up. "You're not leaving this town before that return wire comes," she said, in the tone that brooked no discussion. "Both of you are sleeping under this roof tonight, and I will hear no argument about it. Samuel Hofstede is riding back to tell Clara, and Clara will be here before supper with whatever she's decided to bring, which, knowing Clara, will include her late husband's shotgun and opinions about everything." She moved toward the kitchen with the momentum of a woman whose decision was already implemented. "I'm going to cook. You two are going to sit down and do whatever it is people do when they've been running on fear and stubbornness all day, and need to remember they're still alive." She disappeared into the kitchen. The room settled into a quiet that was different from the careful quiet of the day. Maggie sat at Ruth's table, and the deed was in her hands, and the wire was sent. And for the first time in 2 months, the next move was not hers to make immediately. She had built the machine and set it running. Now it ran. Eli sat across from her. He wasn't watching the street anymore. He was watching her, with the quiet, careful attention she had come to understand was not surveillance, but something else. The look of a man making sure something he had been worried about was still intact. "You're going to win this," he said. Not as encouragement, as an assessment. "We're going to win it," Maggie said. He didn't correct her. He held her gaze for a moment with those pale, serious eyes, and something moved in the space between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have required a stillness neither of them had earned yet. Then Ruth called from the kitchen that she needed someone to work the pump, and Eli went, and Maggie sat with the deed in her hands and the wire singing down the rails toward Jefferson City, and she let herself, for the first time since Harrison's funeral, believe that the ground beneath her feet was going to hold. Outside, somewhere on the Perdition Creek Road, Cole Decker was calculating his next move. But for the first time since he'd thrown her from that wagon, Margaret Calhoun was calculating hers. The return wire came at 7:30 in the evening. Hector Fines brought it himself, walking fast through Ruth's back door with the paper still warm from the machine in his hand, and an expression on his face that Maggie had not seen there before. Something that looked, cautiously, like the beginning of hope. "Jefferson City responded 40 minutes ago," he said, setting the wire on the table in front of her. "I waited to confirm the follow-up transmission before I brought it over." Maggie read it once. Then she set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat on either side of it, and breathed. Eli was across the room. He watched her face and didn't ask. "Thomas got it," she said. "He filed an emergency application with the Federal District Court in Austin at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Judge Harlan Moss. Thomas knows him. They worked the same circuit in '68. Signed a temporary restraining order against any further transfer of Calhoun property, effective immediately. She looked up. "And he's dispatched a federal marshal from Austin with authority to access the Laredo Springs County land records and secure them pending a full audit." Ruth, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and said, "How long to get here from Austin?" 2 days by rail to the Copper Bend Depot, Hector said. "Maybe 3 if there are delays." "Decker has 2 days, Eli said. He was not alarmed. He was simply accounting for the variable the way he accounted for all variables, directly and without flinching from it. He'll know something's changed when Whitmore doesn't hear back from him tonight. And Whitmore will know something's wrong when the wire traffic from Austin starts moving." "Can Whitmore intercept a federal marshal?" Clara Hofstad asked. She had arrived an hour earlier, exactly as Ruth predicted, with her late husband's shotgun, with Samuel, and with opinions, and had been sitting at the table since then with the focused patience of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for 2 years. "Not lawfully," Maggie said. "Whitmore doesn't always work lawfully," Clara said. "No," Maggie agreed, "but he works through channels. That's his entire mechanism. Paperwork, seals, official-looking documents that most people don't know how to challenge. A federal marshal with a court order from Judge Moss is something Whitmore has no channel to work through." She looked at the wire again. "The moment that marshal walks into the Laredo Springs County Records Office, Whitmore's fraudulent transfers become federal evidence. Everything built on them, every property he's seized, every sale he's made to the Texas Pacific, becomes part of a federal fraud case. Then we need to make sure you're alive and standing in Laredo Springs when that marshal arrives," Eli said. He said it plainly, without drama. But the plainness of it was its own kind of weight, and everyone in the room felt it. That night, Ruth Alderman's boarding house became something none of them had planned, and all of them had needed. A gathering place, a war room, a kitchen table around which four people who had been losing the same fight separately discovered they had been winning it alone for too long. Clara spread her 7 years of tax receipts on the table and walked Maggie through every disputed entry. Hector produced the depot's transmission logs going back 18 months, which documented the dates and destinations of every county communication Whitmore's office had routed through the Texas Pacific line. Communications that, taken together, mapped the exact timeline of the fraudulent transfer operation with a precision that no single piece of evidence could have achieved alone. Ruth brought out George's letter, the one in her husband's handwriting that said he'd told Whitmore's office to go to the devil. And Maggie read it and looked up at Ruth and said, "This goes in front of the federal grand jury." And Ruth nodded once, with a particular composure of a woman who has been holding something precious and painful for a long time, and is finally being allowed to put it to use. Eli sat at the end of the table and listened and spoke when he had something specific to add. And twice he went to the window to check the street. And once he went out entirely for 20 minutes and came back without explanation. But Maggie noticed that after he came back, Hatch settled from watchful to relaxed, which told her more than any explanation would have. Near midnight, when Clara and Samuel had taken the upstairs rooms Ruth offered, and Hector had gone back to the depot to sleep in his office with the transmission logs locked in the safe, Ruth brought 2 cups of coffee to the table where Maggie and Eli still sat. "I'm going to bed," Ruth said. "I want both of you to do the same. Tomorrow is going to require every piece of sense you have." She looked at Maggie with a particular directness that was, Maggie had decided, simply Ruth's natural mode of existing in the world. "You fought 2 months alone before yesterday. You don't have to do that anymore." She went upstairs. The house was quiet around them, the kind of deep summer night quiet that carried the sound of crickets and the distant occasional call of a nighthawk, and the cooling of the day's heat as it released slowly from the earth. Maggie held her coffee cup and said, "Tell me something that isn't about Whitmore." Eli looked at her across the table. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," she said. "Something that happened before all of this." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "When I was 12, he said, "my grandmother had a farm in eastern Ohio, river bottom land, good black soil. She kept a kitchen garden that was approximately the size of some counties I've worked in. She could make anything grow." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "She used to say that the secret to a garden was not the planting and not the harvest. It was the tending. That most people wanted to put something in the ground and come back when it was ready, and that's not how growing works." He paused. "I thought about that a lot my first year out here, when everything I'd built at Pinkerton was gone, and I was starting from nothing, and it felt like I was just putting seeds in dry Texas ground and waiting for something that might not come." "Did it come?" Maggie asked. He looked at her steadily. "I'm starting to think so," he said. The quiet between them held for a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them moved to break it. And in the space of that quiet, something settled between them that was different from the careful, provisional alliance of the last 36 hours. Something more permanent and more personal. The kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, but simply becomes true. Then Maggie said, "Get some sleep, Eli." And he said, "You too, Margaret." And they went to their separate rooms, and that was enough for now. Decker came before dawn. Maggie heard Hatch first. A single sharp bark from downstairs, cut off as if the dog had been silenced by a hand signal. And she was on her feet with the Colt in her hand before she was fully awake, her body having apparently decided on its own that the last 2 months warranted a permanent state of readiness. She heard Eli's door open, his boots on the floor, swift and quiet. Then his voice, very low, through her door. "Dress and come out." Side door. She was dressed and out in 45 seconds. The side door of the boarding house opened onto a narrow passage between Ruth's building and the feed store beside it. And Eli was there with the Winchester, and Hatch pressed close against his leg. The sky was the particular deep gray of 4 in the morning, the darkness thinning without yet giving anything away. 3 men, Eli said, barely above a breath. Decker and 2 I don't know. They came in off the south road on foot. They're at the depot. Hector, Maggie said. I know. We have to— Ruth and Clara are awake, he said. Ruth's gone out the back to get Samuel. Clara has the shotgun. He looked at her directly. I need you to stay close to me and not get between me and a line of fire. Can you do that? Yes. I mean it, Margaret. So do I, she said. Let's go. They went around the back of the building, moving through the dark, with Hatch silent at Eli's heel, and came out onto the far end of the main street behind the depot. The building showed a thin line of lamplight under the front door. Hector was inside. Whether Decker had gotten there ahead of them, Maggie couldn't tell. Then the front door of the depot opened, and Cole Decker stepped onto the platform. And he was holding Hector Fines by the collar of his shirt with one hand. And in the other hand, he had a sheaf of papers that Maggie recognized from 50 feet in the dark as the depot's transmission logs. Mrs. Calhoun, Decker's voice carried easily in the dead quiet of 4 in the morning. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. He spoke the way a man speaks when he believes he controls every variable in the immediate situation. I know you're out here. I can see 2 sets of fresh tracks in the street dust. Come out, and we'll resolve this matter in a civilized fashion. Eli put a hand on her arm. She stopped. From inside the depot, Maggie heard a sound she identified after a moment as Hector, trying to speak and being prevented from it. Decker descended the platform steps, still holding Hector, and stopped at the base. The 2 men she didn't know flanked him from the sides of the depot building, one to the east, one to the west, spreading out with the deliberate positioning of men who had done this before. The wire you sent is inadmissible, Decker said into the dark street. Transmitted by a federal employee under duress. Directed by a woman wanted for theft of legal documents. Judge Whitmore will have it quashed before your federal friends make it past San Antonio. He held up the logs. And without these records, there's no documentation of transmission at all. So whatever you think you've built, Mrs. Calhoun, you've built it on paper I'm holding in my hand. Eli's hand was still on her arm. She felt him shift his weight, and she understood what it meant. He was positioning himself for a shot he didn't want to take in the dark, with Hector between them and Decker. But she had stopped calculating Eli's angles and started calculating her own. Because Cole Decker was wrong about one thing. One specific, critical thing. She stepped out of the passage into the street. Eli came with her, 1 step behind and to her left, and she heard the Winchester come up, but she didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on Decker. You're right that those are the depot logs, she said. Her voice was steady. She was mildly surprised by how steady it was. But what you're holding is Hector's file copies. She walked forward 6 steps and stopped. The originals were transmitted to the Texas Pacific Regional Office in San Antonio as standard protocol when Hector logged them. That happened yesterday afternoon, before you came to the depot the first time. The regional office made their own record. Thomas Hale's office in Jefferson City has the transmission confirmation. She looked at him without flinching. You can burn everything in that building, Cole. The record still exists in 3 separate locations that Whitmore's county seal cannot touch. Decker's face didn't move, but his hand tightened on Hector's collar, and that told her everything. The tell of a man whose certainty has just developed a crack and is deciding whether to widen it or retreat. "You're bluffing," he said. "I'm a judge's daughter," Maggie said. "I was raised in a courtroom. I don't bluff with evidence. I document." She took one more step forward. "Let Hector go, Cole. It's over. The federal marshal is already on the train from Austin. Whitmore's transfers are federal evidence. And you," she let that settle for a moment, "are the man whose name appears in Josiah Harker's witness statement, in the coroner's report on Harrison Calhoun, and in 4 separate affidavits I have already submitted to Thomas Hale, describing what you did to me on the Perdition Creek Road." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She could hear her own heartbeat. From the east side of the depot, a sound she recognized. The particular mechanical double click of a shotgun being cocked. Clara Hofstede's voice came from the darkness beside the building, entirely composed. "I have a clear shot from here, Mr. Decker. My husband taught me to shoot in 1861, and I have not gotten worse with practice." The man to the east went very still. From the street to the west, Samuel Hofstede's voice, younger, slightly less steady, but holding. "And I've got the other one, Ma." Decker looked at Eli. Eli was looking back at him with the pale, absolute steadiness of a man who has done the calculation and arrived at a number he is entirely at peace with. "The boy and the woman are amateurs," Decker said to Eli. "Not a threat, an assessment, the way one professional speaks to another." "Yes," Eli said, "but I'm not." Another silence. Hector Fines, in the grip of Cole Decker's fist, made a small sound that, under other circumstances, might have been a laugh. Decker released him. Hector stumbled forward, caught himself on the platform railing, and turned around to face Decker with an expression that mixed profound relief with something that had hardened into something else. The look of a man who has spent 19 years being careful and has just decided to stop. He reached back and took the transmission logs out of Decker's loosened hand, with the calm deliberateness of a man reclaiming something that was his. "I'll need those for the federal record," Hector said. Decker looked at the street around him. Clara to the east, Samuel to the west, Eli directly ahead with a Winchester that had not moved an inch, Maggie between them all, standing in the street in the pre-dawn gray of a Texas summer morning, with a Colt in her good hand, and 4 months of grief and rage and calculation behind her eyes. He was a man who worked through channels, and every channel was closed. He raised his hands slowly. The 2 men who'd come with him did the same, and the sound of that, 4 hands going up in the near dark of Copper Bend's main street, was the most specific, complete silence Maggie had ever heard. They held Decker and his men in Ruth Alderman's locked storeroom until mid-morning, when the southbound Texas Pacific brought 2 county deputies from the next jurisdiction, men outside Whitmore's payroll, men who answered to a sheriff who owed the judge nothing, and took custody with the transmission logs and Hector's sworn statement and Maggie's written account in hand. The federal marshal arrived the following afternoon. His name was Marshal David Cord, and he was a spare, methodical man from Austin, who read Maggie's deed and Thomas Hale's documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a clean case to present itself. And when he finished reading, he looked up and said, "Mrs. Calhoun, I'm going to need you in Laredo Springs in 3 days. Can you manage that?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Good. I'll have the county records secured by tomorrow morning. Judge Whitmore will be served his federal summons before nightfall." He looked at Eli. "Mr. Granger, I understand you have an existing investigative file on this matter." 18 months of it," Eli said. "I'll need that as well." Cord stood and picked up his hat. You'll both be called as witnesses in federal proceedings. That process will take time, months, possibly. I want you to understand that going in." "We understand," Maggie said. The marshal left. Hector went back to his telegraph office. Samuel rode home to mine Clara's property. And Clara Hofstede, before she left, pulled Maggie into a brief, firm embrace that communicated everything practical and nothing sentimental, and was exactly right for that reason. "Come see me when it's done," Clara said. "I will," Maggie said. In the end, Doyle Whitmore was indicted on 31 counts of federal land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of obstruction of federal telegraph communications. He was tried in the federal district court in Austin and convicted on 28 of the 31 counts. Cole Decker, who had no loyalty that outlasted his freedom, provided a complete confession in exchange for a reduced sentence that still put him in a federal penitentiary for 14 years. The Texas Pacific, faced with federal exposure of their arrangement with Whitmore, settled quietly with 11 displaced families, paying restitution that included the Harker family, whom Eli Granger had spent 4 years unable to find, and who turned out to be living in New Mexico, trying to start over on land they didn't own. The Calhoun property on Perdition Creek was formally returned to Margaret Hale Calhoun by federal court order on a Thursday morning in October, when the Texas summer had finally broken and the first real coolness had come down from the north. She was standing on the porch of Ruth Alderman's boarding house when Hector brought her the confirmation wire, and she read it once and folded it and put it in her pocket and stood there for a moment in the October air, breathing. She bought the land adjacent to hers in November, the piece that Whitmore had seized from a family named Pruitt in 1876, and had never managed to sell because it was rough, rocky ground that backed up against the limestone ridge and wasn't useful for cattle. It was useful for horses. She bought it for the assessed value, which was considerably less than it was worth, and she brought the deed to Eli Granger's ranch on a Wednesday afternoon and set it on his kitchen table without preamble. He looked at it. He looked at her. "That's your land," he said. "No," she said. "It adjoins yours on the north side, which means if you fence it together with yours, you've got enough pasture to run 60 horses instead of 12, and the creek access on that ridge is better than what you have now." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I've been talking to the Texas Pacific about a contract for remount horses. They need 300 head a year for their line crews. I know someone with an 18-month investigative file that proves they owe a significant moral debt to this part of Texas, and I intend to use that knowledge in the negotiation." She folded her hands on the table. "I need a partner who knows horses. I don't." Eli looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked at her with those pale, quiet eyes that she had learned to read over 4 months of proximity. The way they stilled when he was processing something important. The way they warmed by degrees so small that you had to be paying close attention to see it. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "In the territory. On my land," she said. "Which is next to your land, which I am proposing we run as a single operation, with a formal business agreement that Thomas Hale will draw up, and which will be entirely above board and properly documented, because I have had my fill of undocumented arrangements." "Is that the only kind of arrangement you're proposing?" Eli said. His voice was careful and completely serious, the way it was when he was asking something that mattered. Maggie looked at him across the table in the afternoon light of the kitchen, where she had eaten her first meal after he pulled her out of a road and decided she was worth saving. She thought about the deed still against her ribs on the day she walked into that kitchen, and the calculation she'd been running about whether to trust him, and how long it had taken her to understand that the calculation was already complete, and she had simply been too afraid to read the result. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, large and calloused and steady, the hand of a man who had built things and lost things and decided to build again. And neither of them said anything more about it, because some things don't require language when the whole of what you've been through together has already said them. Margaret Hale Calhoun did not rebuild the life that had been taken from her on the Perdition Creek Road. She built a better one, on her own terms, in her own name, with her own hand on the deed and her own signature on the contracts, and her own eyes open at last to the difference between a woman who survives what is done to her and a woman who decides what comes next. The land that had been stolen was returned. The man who had stolen it faced justice in a federal court, and the woman who had been thrown into the Texas dust and left for the vultures stood in a courtroom in Austin, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and told a federal jury exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. And the jury believed her, because the truth, properly documented and delivered by a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, is the most powerful force that has ever walked into a court of law. She had come to this country broken and alone, with 3 pages of paper hidden against her ribs and one hand free to fight with. She left it whole, with a partner who was worth trusting, a piece of Texas land that was legally and irrevocably hers, and the certain knowledge that she had not merely survived the summer of 1878, she had ended it on her own terms, and everything that came after was hers to begin.